Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Today, we are diving into a powerful and, frankly, a pretty revolutionary theory. It's one that links the microscopic machinery of your energy production deep inside your cells to the huge health crises we're all facing today.
That's right. We're looking at what our sources are calling a silent, almost invisible physiological failure, a kind of hidden root cause for this modern epidemic of chronic diseases.
And what's so fascinating is that we're shifting the focus completely. It's not just about the thyroid gland itself, that little butterfly-shaped gland in your neck.
Not at all. The real story is happening at the destination, not the source. Our mission today is to really get into cellular T3 starvation.
And this isn't the kind of hypothyroidism that just, shows up neatly on a standard lab panel.
No, this is much more subtle and much more devastating in the long run. It's a state where your body's fundamental energy factories, the mitochondria, are literally being starved, even when the overall supply of thyroid hormone looks perfectly fine on paper.
Which is the frustrating part for so many people. And central to this whole hypothesis is one critical measurement. It's a metric that our sources say is the keyhole into this whole cellular problem.
The T3 port RT3 ratio.
Exactly. T3 or triiodothyronine, that's the active energy hormone, right?
That's the gas pedal. And RT3, reverse T3, is its inactive mirror image. It's the brake. The ratio between the gas and the brake tells a profound story about what's happening inside your cells.
And our sources, they draw a really clear line in the sand. They
Right.
say if your T3 to an RT3 ratio falls below 10,
A ratio of less than 10, yes. The hypothesis is that you are likely suffering from a widespread T3 deficiency, but at the cellular level. That's the key.
So this deep dive is pretty unique because we're pulling together a few different fields.
We really are. It's endocrinology, it's epidemiology, and it's also medical history.
Yeah.
We're looking at a complex argument that suggests this cellular problem isn't just, a personal issue. It's a population-wide crisis, one that was kicked into high gear by historical shifts in how medicine even diagnoses and treats low thyroid function.
And we have some incredible source material for this. There's a link to a 60-year rise in concurrent chronic diseases in the U.S. It's like charting a perfect storm where all this physiological stress met a diagnostic blind spot.
A massive blind spot.
So today, we're going to break all of this down. We'll get into the mechanics, the history, the modern factors that are making it worse, and then we'll look at the visual evidence itself, these chronic disease plots that start back in the 1960s.
And our goal is to give you a shortcut to understanding this potential root cause of root causes, the one that might be sitting underneath conditions like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, brain fog, and just this widespread inflammation that so many people are dealing with.
Let's get into it.
So let's start with the real basics of cellular metabolism. Thyroid hormones, they're essential. They regulate the metabolic rate of pretty much every single cell in your body.
And they don't just, speed things up?
No, it's more sophisticated than that. They control gene expression, specifically genes related to energy production, protein synthesis, how you use nutrients.
Yeah.
It's fundamental.
Okay, but standard medical practice, it seems to rely almost entirely on TSH, right? Thyroid stimulating hormone. And maybe T4, thyroxine, which I understand is the storage hormone.
That's right.
So why do so many people, and you hear this all the time, report feeling symptomatic, exhausted, cold, brain fogged when their TSH and T4 tests are declared normal?
Because those tests are looking at the wrong part of the supply chain. Think about it. TSH is just a signal. It's the pituitary gland shouting at the thyroid gland, hey, make more hormone, or okay, slow down.
It's the order form.
It's the order form, exactly. And T4 is the supply truck. It's the vast majority of hormone that leaves the thyroid. But it's inert. It can't do anything until it gets converted.
So the standard tests, they're measuring the signal strength and the number of trucks on the road.
Yes, but they completely fail to measure the activity at the final destination. They don't tell you if the packages are actually being delivered and opened inside the cell's machinery. We miss the entire cellular context.
So the body might be delivering enough raw material, the T4, but the cells are failing to use the finished product.
That's it in a nutshell.
And this brings us to the real players in this story. The active hormone, T3, and its metabolic nemesis, reverse T3.
T3 is the key to everything. T4 is converted into active T3 mostly in peripheral tissues, your liver, kidneys, muscles. This happens through specialized enzymes called deodainase, specifically type 1 and type 2.
And once it's T3, it's ready to go to work.
It's highly bioavailable. It binds to receptors inside the cell nucleus and inside the mitochondria to turn the metabolic engine on. It's the on switch.
Okay, so where does RT3, reverse T3 come from? Is it like a mistake in the manufacturing process?
Not a mistake, no. It's actually a very clever, a calculated defense mechanism. When your body senses duress, and that could be anything from severe stress, trauma, starvation, systemic inflammation, even acute illness, it activates a different enzyme.
A third one.
A third one, deiodinase type 3, or D3. And D3's job is to convert T4 not into active T3, but into reverse T3,
The brake pedal.
the emergency brake.
Let's get a bit more technical here, because you called RT3 a lookalike molecule earlier. What's the actual molecular difference that makes it inactive?
That's a great question. It gets us past the simple analogy. So chemically, T4 is tetroidothionein. It has 4 iodine atoms.
Yep.
To become active T3, an iodine atom is removed from its outer ring. Now it has 3, and it fits the receptor perfectly.
So T3 is tetroidothionein, 3 iodine atoms.
Right. But RT3 also has 3 iodine atoms. The difference is where the atom was removed from. For RT3, the iodine is removed from the inner ring.
Ah, so it's a subtle change in the geometry of the molecule.
A very subtle but critical geometric difference. And it means that RT3 is structurally useless for the main thyroid receptors inside the cell nucleus and the mitochondria.
So it's like having a key that looks almost identical, but one of the grooves is in the wrong place.
Exactly. The key fits in the lock, but it can't turn. It just jams it.
And it prevents the right key from getting in.
Now you've got it. That's the problem. When RT3 levels surge because of stress or inflammation, these wrong keys saturate the bloodstream. They start competing aggressively with a much smaller pool of active T3 for entry into the cell.
It's a numbers game.
It's a numbers game, and if the cell takes in an RT3 molecule, that molecule binds to the receptor, but instead of signaling accelerate metabolism, it just sits there. It occupies the site and signals a metabolic shutdown.
Wow. So it actively switches the cell into a low-power, energy-saving mode.
It does, which is useful if you're, say, starving in the wilderness and need to conserve every calorie. It's a survival mechanism.
But it's a disaster if you're just trying to get through a stressful work week.
It's a total disaster.
So the critical consequence of a high RT3 level, and therefore a low T3 port RT3 ratio, is something called competitive inhibition.
Precisely. The inactive molecule is actively blocking the beneficial one from doing its job.
And this inability to get T3 into the nuclear and mitochondrial receptors means the cell just can't make the energy it needs.
It can't synthesize the proteins required for full energy production, and this persistent, unaddressed lack of energy at the very core of the cell. That is the definition of cellular T3 starvation. The machinery is powered down. The sources describe it as being hamstrung.
And this deficit would be systemic, right? It's not just in one part of the body. It would hit every tissue, every organ.
Every single one.
Which explains the next claim, which is so profound, that this resulting mitochondrial collapse serves as a root cause of root causes of most chronic diseases. How does a failure in energy translate into big, specific illnesses?
It does it by slowly, systematically degrading the cell's defenses and functions over a long period of time. Think about what T3 does for the mitochondria. It promotes something called mitochondrial biogenesis, the creation of new, healthy mitochondria. It keeps them efficient.
So when they're starved of T3,
2 main things happen. First, lower ATP production. ATP is the energy currency of the cell, so the cell literally runs out of gas.
which manifests as fatigue, poor muscle tone, slow thinking.
All the classic symptoms. But second, and this is crucial, you get increased oxidative stress. Failing, struggling mitochondria are messy. They start spewing out more reactive oxygen species, or ROS, free radicals.
And because the cell is in low power mode, it doesn't have the energy to clean up the mess.
Exactly. It lacks the energy to efficiently repair DNA damage or clear out cellular waste through a process called autophagy.
So the cell is running slowly, it's accumulating damage, and it doesn't have the resources to take out the trash. That sounds like a textbook definition of accelerated cellular aging and vulnerability.
It is. Now, apply that system-wide. In your gut, low energy means the connections between cells, the tight junctions, get compromised. That contributes to leaky gut and systemic inflammation.
Which then creates more RT3.
A vicious cycle. In your immune system, the T cells and macrophages become sluggish. They can't fight off pathogens properly, and you're more likely to develop chronic inflammatory or autoimmune responses.
In the liver, detoxification pathways slow down, letting toxins just recirculate.
You see how this widespread energy deficit creates the fertile ground, the root cause of root causes, upon which different diseases can then take hold. Your specific genetic weak spots or environmental exposures will determine whether that manifests as diabetes or heart failure or an autoimmune condition. The cell's natural defenses have atrophied.
Right, so the sources are careful to make that distinction. T3 starvation doesn't directly cause leukemia, for example,
No.
but it creates the systemic energy deficit that makes your body profoundly susceptible to it. It just lowers your innate resilience across the board.
Precisely. And that T3 put RT3 ratio below 10 is essentially a measurement of that failing cellular resilience.
It's the point where the mitochondrial collapse is severe enough to allow multiple, seemingly unrelated chronic diseases to gain traction at the same time.
And that's the key to understanding the data we're going to look at later, the rise of concurrent diseases.
It's clear that this mechanism, the body making RT3 under stress, has always existed. It's a survival tool. So what makes it an epidemic now?
Ah, that's where the history comes in.
The historical perspective from our sources is just indispensable here. It points to a really critical change in medical management.
We have to go back in time to before the late 1950s. The way doctors diagnosed low thyroid was radically different. There were no high-volume, standardized TSH blood tests like we have today.
So it wasn't a numbers game from a lab report?
Not at all. Diagnosis was more of an art form. It relied heavily on a symptom-based clinical determination.
So what were they looking at? What tools did they use if they couldn't just draw blood?
They used comprehensive clinical observation and some really clever low-tech measurements that were proxies for metabolic rate.
Like what?
Well, they'd have patients monitor their basal body temperature first thing in the morning over several days. A consistently low temperature was a huge red flag for a low metabolism.
Simple but effective.
Very. They also checked ankle reflexes. There's a classic sign called the slow relaxing phase of the Achilles tendon reflex. A sluggish response is a hallmark of low thyroid.
I've heard of that.
And they even had basal metabolic rate, or BMR, testing. It was cumbersome. It physically measured your oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production at rest.
So it was labor intensive.
Very. But it measured actual function, not just the supply of hormones in the blood.
And the treatment back then, what was the go-to medication?
This is the crucial element. The treatment was typically natural or desiccated thyroid extract, DTE. It was derived from animal thyroid glands, usually porcine.
And what's in that?
It's a complex hormonal cocktail. It contained T4, but also T3, T2, and T1. Critically, it contained active T3 right in the pill.
Okay, so if a patient showed up back then with all the classic symptoms, fatigue, weight gain, feeling cold, they were treated with a full-spectrum hormone replacement that included the active stuff, T3.
Yes, and here is the great accident of history. Let's say that patient's symptoms were actually being caused by high stress or hidden inflammation, which was driving up their RT3 production.
Which the doctor would have no way of knowing about molecularly.
No idea. But the DTE treatment, because it provided a direct dose of active T3, would have effectively overpowered that RT3 blockade at the cellular level.
So the extra T3 molecules would just outcompete the RT3 for the receptors.
Exactly. It would have raised the functional T3-RT3 ratio inside the cell, resolving the symptoms, even if the doctor didn't know the first thing about reverse T3.
So the old protocol, it was accidentally functional against the RT3 mechanism.
It was a clinical approach that, by focusing on symptoms, addressed the physiological reality, even if the molecular mechanism was a complete black box at the time.
But then everything changed.
Everything changed. Starting in the 1950s and really taking over in the 1960s, Western medicine executed a massive protocol shift.
The post-1950s switch.
Right. The pharmaceutical industry figured out how to synthesize levothyroxine pure synthetic T4. And at the same time, the TSH blood test was developed and established as the primary standardized diagnostic tool.
What was the thinking behind such a huge change? It seems like they were fixing something that wasn't broken.
The driving force was standardization. TSH testing offered an objective, quantifiable number. It fit perfectly with the new era of evidence-based, laboratory-driven medicine.
And the T4-only medication.
T4 monotherapy was seen as cleaner, more modern. It was chemically pure, easy to manufacture in consistent doses, and T4 has a longer half-life, which means more predictable dosing. The idea was simple. Just give the body the T4 reservoir, and it will naturally convert exactly what it needs into T3. Problem solved.
But that core assumption that everyone converts T4 perfectly into T3 under all conditions is precisely what the sources are challenging.
It's the fatal flaw in the model, especially given the modern world we live in, which is full of RT3 boosting factors.
And this leads to that really profound and, frankly, unsettling historical question that's raised in our source material.
Yes. We have to ask it. Who was it that said that no study was done to determine what we were leaving behind when Western medicine switched the population from dedicated thyroid to only T4?
That is just staggering. That silence is deafening. It implies an entire population was moved from a treatment that was relieving symptoms to a new monotherapy based on a theory,
A theoretical conversion model, yes.
without ever establishing a clinical comparison, without looking at the long-term health of the people who might have actually needed that direct T3 to feel well.
You could call it intellectual hubris disguised as progress. The medical community essentially declared the thyroid problem solved, replaceable by T4 alone.
And in doing so, they created this profound blind spot.
A massive one. The new TSH and T4 blood tests were completely incapable of detecting this emerging physiological problem. A patient could have a perfect TSH, perfect T4, but if their RT3 was sky high from stress, they would be starving at the cellular level.
And they'd be symptomatic.
Highly symptomatic.
Yeah.
And they would be systematically dismissed by this new standard of care, told, your labs are normal, it must be in your head.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this change didn't just affect diagnosed thyroid patients. It created a silent, unaddressed vulnerability in the entire population right at the moment when external stressors were about to start their steep climb into the modern era.
That's right.
We now had a diagnostic tool, the TSH test, that was actively reassuring doctors that a symptomatic patient was fine.
Which allowed the cellular starvation mechanism to run completely unchecked for decades in millions of people.
So the change in protocol acted as the catalyst.
It was the catalyst. It took a pre-existing defense mechanism, RT3 production, and turned it into a chronic population-level disease accelerator by taking away the one accidental treatment that was actually keeping it in check.
The active P3.
The active T3.
So if the protocol shift was the catalyst that created this huge blind spot,
Then the conditions of modern life are the accelerant. They're what's fanning the flames.
we have to look at these modern stressors and how they directly hijack that T4 conversion process to favor RT3.
It's almost as if the body interprets every single hardship of the 21st century, from a bad night's sleep to processed food, as a famine or a mortal threat.
And it responds by slamming on the metabolic handbrake.
That is the core interpretation, yes. Our sources are very clear on this. They highlight 4 major categories of modern factors that are cranking up reverse T3 production, wrecking that T3.RT3 ratio for millions.
And they are.
A less healthy lifestyle in general, increased stress, more environmental contaminants, and increased inflammation.
Let's break down the stress pathway. How does a signal of, say, work stress travel from your brain all the way down to your thyroid hormone metabolism?
It's primarily through the HPA axis, the hyperthalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and the production of cortisol.
The stress hormone.
Exactly. When you are under chronic stress, emotional, physical, doesn't matter, your adrenal glands are constantly pumping out cortisol. And we know that high cortisol levels directly upregulate the expression of that enzyme, deiodases type 3, D3,
The one that makes RT3.
the one that makes RT3. It's the body trying to protect itself, trying to slow down and conserve energy during what it perceives as a prolonged crisis.
So the chronic stress of traffic, deadlines, poor sleep, it's not just in your head. It's actively chemically shifting your energy currency toward the inactive form,
Absolutely. The second major accelerant is systemic inflammation.
which can be driven by a poor diet, hidden infections.
All of the above. Inflammatory cytokines, these are signaling molecules like interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, are potent metabolic disruptors. They send a signal to the liver and other tissues to conserve energy. So they slow the conversion of T4 to active T3, and at the same time they ramp up the conversion of T4 to RT3. Inflammation physically disables your ability to use the hormone you have.
That sounds like a devastating feedback loop.
It is.
So you have inflammation, which causes high RT3,
Right.
that leads to cellular starvation, which then weakens your immune system and your gut lining, which then increases inflammation, loading even more RT3.
That is the vicious cycle. That is what sustains this condition and makes it chronic.
And we haven't even touched on environmental contaminants.
Right. We are living in a chemical soup. Endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs, are everywhere.
Yeah.
Plasticizers, pesticides, heavy metals, many of these chemicals have to be processed by your liver.
And the liver is a major site of T4 to T3 conversion.
Exactly. So when the liver is chronically burdened with detoxification, trying to clear out phthalates or mercury, it gets sluggish. It can't perform its other metabolic duties as well, including that crucial T4 to T3 conversion. And some toxins are even known to specifically interfere with the deiodinase enzymes themselves, often favoring the RT3 pathway.
Okay, so the picture's becoming incredibly clear. The historical protocol shift created the vulnerability.
It opened the door.
And all these modern stressors, the cortisol, the inflammation from our food, the toxins in our environment, they're acting like a constant bellows, just stoking the fires of RT3 production across the entire population.
This is truly the perfect storm convergence.
It is.
And this convergence basically guarantees that RT3 levels are structurally fundamentally higher in the modern population than they were 70 or 80 years ago.
And because nobody is being routinely tested for RT3, only TSH and maybe T4, this chronic physiological state goes almost entirely uncaught.
It's a hidden epidemic.
So the end result of this chronic energy deficit is what the sources call a gradual cell natural defense atrophy. How long does it take for this power down to actually show up as a diagnosed chronic disease?
It's not like a switch flips. It's a cumulative process. The atrophy happens over years, even decades. As the mitochondria are chronically starved, cells lose their ability to perform their most energy-intensive functions. Hormone signaling gets garbled. Cell membrane integrity gets compromised. Critical enzymes lose their efficiency.
It's a slow decay of function.
It is. And this prolonged systemic energy deficit is what sets the stage for the development and often the progression of multiple concurrent chronic illnesses. We're talking about a chronic subclinical metabolic depression that touches every single biological pathway in the body.
Which is why it could affect such a massive segment of the population, leading to the kind of epidemiological trends we're about to look at.
It's the only way to explain the data.
Okay, so let's move this hypothesis from the theoretical and the physiological into observable reality. We have to look at the data presented in the sources. This chart that tracks the rise of chronic conditions in the U.S. from 1963 to 2023.
Yes. This visualization is, in effect, the historical footprint of the cellular failure we've just spent all this time describing.
And when you look at this 60-year plot, what's striking is it's not just an increase, it's a relentless, almost linear acceleration of illness. Let's break down these lines for everyone listening.
Okay, so we have two main trend lines. The first one, the orange line, is tracking the prevalence of having one or more chronic conditions, and that line is steep. In 1963, about 45% of the U.S. population reported having at least one chronic health condition.
Which is already pretty high.
It is. But you fast forward 60 years to 2023, and that figure has climbed to about 75%.
75%. 3 out of every 4 people today are managing at least one long-term health issue. I mean, that increase alone aligns perfectly with the rise of all those modern stressors we just talked about.
Exactly. The poor diet, the sedentary lifestyle, the environmental toxicity, all the factors that we know drive up RT3. That orange line shows a clear population-wide degradation of general health tied to the modern environment.
But it's the second line that's the real bombshell here.
Absolutely. The true significance of the hypothesis lies in the blue line. This one is tracking the prevalence of having 2 or more chronic conditions. This is the metric the sources identify as the real smoking gun.
Okay, so let's focus on that blue line. What's its trajectory?
Its slip is just as alarming. In 1963, the prevalence of having 2 or more concurrent chronic conditions, it started at around 15% of the population.
1.5.
1.5, yes. By 2023, that number had doubled, reaching approximately 30%.
30% of the population is dealing with multiple chronic illnesses at the same time.
Yes. And this represents a profound shift. We've moved from a world of individual siloed illnesses to one of widespread comorbidity.
So why is this concurrent disease plot, the 2 or more diseases? Why is that the most powerful piece of evidence supporting the T3 starvation hypothesis?
Because it completely challenges the old assumptions of individualized disease causality. Think about it. Before this mid-century turning point, medical convention basically held that if someone developed multiple major, seemingly unrelated chronic diseases, say, type 2 diabetes and also rheumatoid arthritis,
This is just considered incredibly bad luck.
or a severe genetic vulnerability, the diagnosis was you were dealt a bad hand genetically. The statistical odds of 2 separate, complex, chronic conditions just spontaneously happening in the same person without a major genetic predisposition were very low.
But the chart shows this is no longer a rarity. It's doubled. It's common. This can't be explained by a sudden massive genetic mutation across the population. Our genes don't change that fast.
They absolutely do not. And that's the point. The dramatic, uniform population shift you see in that 2 or more chronic disease chart, it strongly suggests a common root cause of root causes.
A single systemic vulnerability.
Yes. Something foundational that's affecting a wide population all at once, regardless of their specific individual genetic destiny. The mechanism has to be deep enough to allow failures in multiple disparate organ systems, cardiac, endocrine, neurological, to all happen concurrently in the same person.
And the hypothesis provides that perfect common denominator.
It does.
The chronic systemic energy deficit caused by that unaddressed T3.RT3 imbalance,
Yeah.
the mitochondrial collapse.
Yes. When the cell's natural defenses atrophy because they don't have enough T3-driven energy, the failure is systemic. It's everywhere. It doesn't just affect one tissue type. It impairs the ability of all tissues to repair themselves and function properly. And that opens the door for 2 or 3 or 4 chronic diseases to set in at the same time.
Now let's nail down the timing. The plot shows this steep climb starting in the early 1960s. What can we deduce about causality from that specific origin point?
That origin point is the definitive historical marker. It's the linchpin of the argument. The climb of that 2 or more chronic disease plot begins precisely around the time that medicine changed its thyroid protocol.
Right when the reliance on TSH and T4 blood tests became the standard.
And right when T3 was effectively removed as a mainstream treatment option. It's the exact moment when the physiological problem rising RT3 from modern stress became systematically hidden by the new medical standard of care.
Wow. So the rise in people with one chronic disease, that orange line, that tracks with the general rise in modern toxicity and bad habits.
A general decline in health, yes.
But the explosion in people with 2 or more concurrent diseases, starting right when the medical protocols changed, that's the data point that just screens foundational systemic failure.
It does.
It suggests the new standard of care unwittingly enabled a chronic power down of cellular defenses for millions and millions of people.
The rise in chronic disease prevalence isn't just about the new environmental factors. It's about the failure to diagnose and treat the body's physiological adaptation to those factors. The confluence of rising stressors and the removal of a broad-spectrum treatment, immediately followed by the steady rise of comorbidity, is the most powerful circumstantial evidence you could ask for.
Okay, it's time to pull this all together. Let's synthesize this into that single cohesive narrative. The physiology, the history, the modern accelerants, and that epidemiological data plot. This is the argument for this smoking gun.
All right. We've established 4, I think, undeniable points. First, the modern stressors. A huge segment of the population is now constantly exposed to factors, stress, inflammation, environmental toxins, that aggressively push the conversion of T4 toward inactive reverse T3.
Fact 1, the pressure is on.
Fact 2, cellular failure. This surge in RT3 leads to competitive inhibition at the cell receptor, causing persistent cellular T3 starvation. This kicks off a silent mitochondrial power down at the most fundamental level of energy production.
The engine is sputtering.
Fact 3, the historical blind spot. The medical system, after the 1950s, adopted diagnostic protocols, TSH and T4 tests, that completely failed to detect this silent mitochondrial starvation. It hides the problem from clinical view, and at the same time, it removed the one historical treatment, active T3, that might have accidentally fixed it.
So we stopped looking for the problem right when we stopped using the solution.
Precisely. And that brings us to fact 4, the epidemiological correlation. The origin point and the steep, relentless climb of the concurrent chronic disease plot that 2 or more conditions line begins in perfect synchrony with the adoption of these new limited diagnostic and treatment standards.
And that confluence, that collision of rising physiological stress with systemic diagnostic failure, that is what our sources identify as the smoking gun.
It is.
It provides a mechanism and a historical timeline. It explains how an entire population could shift from a state where having multiple chronic diseases was a genetic rarity to a state where it now affects nearly 1 in 3 people.
The implication is unavoidable. The unaddressed T3.RT3 imbalance, acting as this engine for cellular defense atrophy, is the single most powerful driver behind the population-level increase in concurrent chronic diseases. This one mechanism explains comorbidity far better than trying to attribute multiple disparate diseases to a dozen different unrelated genetic flukes.
It also forces you, the listener, to fundamentally reconsider symptoms. Things like general fatigue, brain fog, stubborn weight gain. They aren't just inevitable signs of aging or just stress.
No. They may be the subjective manifestations of a real chronic systemic energy deficit that the current standard of care is simply not designed to look for.
So if you're out there managing 2 or more chronic issues, the hypothesis is that this plot applies directly to you.
The odds are that this common root cause of root causes is affecting you at the cellular level, This metabolic depression sets the energy bar so low that your body is simply unable to keep up with repairs or sustain full spectrum immune function against all the various insults of modern life. That ratio is the marker of the systemic defense failure.
The whole narrative is just so compelling and comprehensive. Medical progress, which was driven by this need for standardization, inadvertently created a massive, unaddressed physiological vulnerability. And it did it right when environmental and societal stress levels started climbing through the roof.
And the result is what we see in that chart, a visible, decades-long epidemic of multisystem disease.
We're seeing the consequences of treating the signal, the TSH level, instead of treating the functional outcome for the actual patient.
And the failure to include RT3 and free T3 in routine blood work allows this systemic power down to just continue year after year, decade after decade, until it finally manifests as complex concurrent illness.
So after all of that, what does this all mean for you, for the person listening? The key takeaway from this deep dive really has to be the urgent need to distinguish between your system-wide thyroid levels and your cellular thyroid function. The focus has to shift. It's not enough to just check if your thyroid gland is producing enough hormone. You have to confirm that your cells are actually able to receive and use the active energy currency, T3.
And if your standard labs, your TSH and T4, have always come back looking fine, but you are struggling with chronic symptoms, or worse, you're already managing multiple chronic diagnoses, you now have critical knowledge to help you investigate deeper.
The standard population-based approach might be failing you because it's not designed to identify this widespread systemic root cause.
The actionable knowledge that comes directly from this source material is straightforward, and it's powerful.
Ask your doctor for the blood test T3.RT3 ratio, and to get that, you'll need them to order free T3 and reverse T3.
Yes, those are the two tests you need.
If that ratio is calculated and it is less than 10, then you have real objective evidence suggesting you may be T3 starved at the cellular level, no matter what your TSH and T4 labs look like.
It means you likely have a higher level of those inactive RT3 lookalike molecules, and they are competitively inhibiting active T3 from getting into your cells, switching your entire system into that low metabolic rate and leading to that cellular defense atrophy we've been talking about.
This entire deep dive, it forces us to question some really established medical assumptions. The long-term wisdom of those protocols shifts from the mid-20th century.
The coincidence of the rise of concurrent chronic disease with the change in diagnosis and treatment is just too profound to ignore. This knowledge empowers you to look beyond the standard metrics and to demand a more comprehensive assessment of your cellular metabolism.
And we want to leave you with this final provocative thought to consider.
If the relentless rise of chronic disease accelerates at the precise historical moment when the population was systematically switched from symptom-based diagnosis using natural T3-containing thyroid hormone to a T4-only synthetic treatment based solely on a limited set of blood tests, then what is the ultimate cost of prioritizing administrative standardization over individual cellular energy regulation?
Is the current medical threshold for diagnosing hypothyroidism fundamentally missing a massive hidden population problem?
One that is silently driving the increase in comorbidities, not just in the U.S., but across the entire globe. That is the question that the T3 to an RT3 ratio forces every single one of us to confront.